July 17th, 1918. A basement in Yekaterinburg, Russia. In the pre-dawn darkness, 11 people stand together for the last time. Emperor Nicholas II, his wife, Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. 4 loyal servants who refused to abandon them. They have been told they're being photographed for propaganda purposes, to prove they're still alive. Within minutes, all 11 will be dead, executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries in one of history's most brutal murders. But this is more than a story of an execution. This is the story of how the most powerful dynasty in Europe collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. A love story, a medical mystery, a political catastrophe, and a revolution that would reshape the 20th century. This is the story of Russia's last royal family. To understand how the Romanovs met their end, we must return to the beginning, to a young man who never wanted to be emperor. Nicholas Romanov was born in 1868, the eldest son of Alexander III. He was a sensitive boy, intelligent but not brilliant, who loved his family more than power. His father was a giant of a man, physically imposing, politically conservative, and utterly convinced of autocratic rule. Nicholas grew up in his shadow. In 1894, when Nicholas was just 26, his father died suddenly. The young man was devastated. He confided to his cousin, "I am not ready to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." But destiny cared nothing for his doubts. Nicholas II was crowned in May 1896 in a ceremony of unparalleled splendor. He became the ruler of 1/6 of the world's land surface, commanding 130 million subjects. The Russian Empire stretched from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. On paper, he was the most powerful monarch on earth. But his reign began with a terrible omen. During the coronation festivities at Kodinka Field in Moscow, a crowd of 500,000 peasants surged forward to receive commemorative gifts. In the chaos, over 1,300 people were trampled to death. Nicholas wanted to cancel the celebrations, but his advisors insisted he continue, that showing weakness would undermine his authority. That night, while bodies were still being cleared from the field, the Tsar and his new wife danced at the French ambassador's ball. The people would not forget. But there was one bright light in Nicholas's life: his marriage to Princess Alex of Hesse, granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. Nicholas had fallen deeply in love with her years earlier, and she with him. Their love was genuine and profound. Nicholas called her Sonny. She called him Nicky. Their letters to each other are extraordinary, passionate, tender, completely devoted. In an age of arranged royal marriages, theirs was a true love match. Alex converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. She was beautiful, intelligent, and utterly devoted to her husband. Between 1895 and 1901, she gave birth to 4 daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. They were a picture of domestic happiness. But there was a problem that would ultimately help destroy the dynasty. Russia needed a male heir.
On July 30th, 1904, after 9 years of marriage and 4 daughters, Alexandra finally gave birth to a son, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich. Church bells rang across Russia. The dynasty seemed secure. But within weeks, the imperial family discovered a devastating secret. Alexei had hemophilia B, a genetic bleeding disorder passed through Alexandra from her grandmother, Queen Victoria. His blood couldn't clot properly. A simple bruise could cause internal bleeding. A fall could be fatal. In the early 1900s, there was no treatment. Most hemophiliac boys died before adulthood. The diagnosis was catastrophic. Alexandra was consumed with guilt. She had passed this curse to her beloved son. Nicholas was heartbroken, but tried to remain strong. The couple made a fateful decision. They would keep Alexei's condition a complete secret. This secrecy would have enormous consequences. The Russian people saw their future Tsar as a mysterious, sickly child who rarely appeared in public. Rumors spread. Was he disabled? Deformed? The truth might have generated sympathy. The silence generated suspicion. Alexandra's personality changed dramatically. The warm young woman became anxious, controlling, paranoid. She lived in constant terror that Alexei would be injured. She began to withdraw from court life, avoiding the public she saw as a threat to her son. Alexandra's unpopularity grew. The Russian aristocracy found her cold and haughty. The people thought she looked down on them. Her German heritage became a liability, especially as tensions with Germany increased. She became known as the German woman. But within the family, a different Alexandra existed. Home movies show her laughing with her daughters, playing with Alexei, relaxing with Nicholas. She was a devoted mother who read to her children, nursed them when they were sick, and created a warm home life, despite the gilded cage they inhabited. The four grand duchesses grew into beautiful, intelligent young women. Olga, the eldest, was thoughtful and musical. Tatiana was elegant and organized, her mother's right hand. Maria was warm and loving, the beauty of the family. Anastasia was the imp, witty and mischievous, famous for her pranks. They called themselves Otiame, taking the first letter of each name. They shared bedrooms, dressed similarly, and were inseparable, despite their wealth and status. Nicholas and Alexandra raised them with surprising simplicity. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich. Church bells rang across Russia. The dynasty seemed secure. But within weeks, the imperial family discovered a devastating secret. Alexei had hemophilia B, a genetic bleeding disorder passed through Alexandra from her grandmother, Queen Victoria. His blood couldn't clot properly. A simple bruise could cause internal bleeding. A fall could be fatal. In the early 1900s, there was no treatment. Most hemophiliac boys died before adulthood. The diagnosis was catastrophic. Alexandra was consumed with guilt. She had passed this curse to her beloved son. Nicholas was heartbroken, but tried to remain strong. The couple made a fateful decision. They would keep Alexei's condition a complete secret. This secrecy would have enormous consequences. The Russian people saw their future Tsar as a mysterious, sickly child who rarely appeared in public. Rumors spread. Was he disabled? Deformed? The truth might have generated sympathy. The silence generated suspicion. Alexandra's personality changed dramatically. The warm young woman became anxious, controlling, paranoid. She lived in constant terror that Alexei would be injured. She began to withdraw from court life, avoiding the public she saw as a threat to her son. Alexandra's unpopularity grew. The Russian aristocracy found her cold and haughty. The people thought she looked down on them. Her German heritage became a liability, especially as tensions with Germany increased. She became known as the German woman. But within the family, a different Alexandra existed. Home movies show her laughing with her daughters, playing with Alexei, relaxing with Nicholas. She was a devoted mother who read to her children, nursed them when they were sick, and created a warm home life, despite the gilded cage they inhabited. The four grand duchesses grew into beautiful, intelligent young women. Olga, the eldest, was thoughtful and musical. Tatiana was elegant and organized, her mother's right hand. Maria was warm and loving, the beauty of the family. Anastasia was the imp, witty and mischievous, famous for her pranks. They called themselves Otiame, taking the first letter of each name. They shared bedrooms, dressed similarly, and were inseparable, despite their wealth and status. Nicholas and Alexandra raised them with surprising simplicity. The Grand Duchesses slept on hard camp beds, without pillows, and took cold baths in the morning. The Emperor wanted them to understand that privilege came with duty, that they were not merely decorative figures, but future servants of Russia. It was an idyllic childhood in many ways, but it was built on sand. Outside the palace walls, Russia was changing, and the Romanovs weren't changing with it. While the Romanovs lived in splendor, most Russians lived in misery. Peasants worked the land they didn't own, paying crushing taxes to absentee landlords. Industrial workers labored 14-hour days in dangerous factories for starvation wages. Political dissent was met with imprisonment or exile to Siberia. Nicholas believed in autocracy with an almost religious conviction. He saw himself as appointed by God to rule Russia, responsible only to God, not to his people. When advisors suggested reforms, a constitution, an elected parliament, he saw it as heresy, a betrayal of his sacred duty. In 1904, Nicholas blundered into a disastrous war with Japan. Russia, a great European power, was humiliated by an Asian nation it had dismissed as inferior. Military defeats sparked unrest at home. On January 22, 1905, a peaceful march of workers approached the Winter Palace, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar. They wanted to petition Nicholas for better conditions. They believed he was their little father who would protect them, if he only knew their suffering. Nicholas wasn't even in the palace that day, but his uncle, Grand Duke Vladimir, gave the order to fire. Hundreds were killed, hundreds more wounded. Blood stained the snow red. Bloody Sunday shattered the myth of the Tsar as the people's father. It was a psychological turning point. The social contract between the Romanovs and the Russian people, which said that the Tsar would protect them and they would revere him, was broken forever. Revolution swept Russia. Strikes paralyzed cities. Mutinies erupted in the military, most famously on the battleship Potemkin. Socialist revolutionaries assassinated government officials. Lenin and his Bolsheviks, operating from exile, called for the overthrow of the Tsarist system. Nicholas finally conceded. In October 1905, he issued a manifesto promising civil liberties and an elected parliament, the Duma. Nicholas hated making this concession. He felt he'd betrayed his father's legacy and his oath to God. From that moment, he looked for ways to undermine the Duma, to claw back autocratic power. He had learned nothing from the crisis, except that showing weakness invited more demands. As political crisis swirled around them, the imperial family retreated further into their own world. They spent more time at their palace in Tsarskoye Selo, away from Petersburg and its dangerous politics. They sailed on their yacht, the Standard. They visited their summer estate in Levadia, on the Crimean coast. In these protected spaces, they could be a normal family. Nicholas could play with his son, walk his dogs, smoke cigarettes in the garden. Alexandra could focus on her children. The Grand Duchesses could be teenagers, gossiping, reading novels, falling in and out of love with officers on the yacht. But in 1905, as revolution raged and Alexei suffered a terrible bleeding episode that nearly killed him, a strange figure entered their lives. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and his presence would seal the family's doom. Grigory Rasputin was born in 1869 in a Siberian peasant village. Barely literate, he became a wandering holy man, a starets, a tradition in Russian Orthodoxy. He claimed to have visions, to commune with God, to possess healing powers. Rasputin was magnetic and terrifying in equal measure. He stood 6 feet tall, with wild hair and piercing blue-gray eyes that people found hypnotic. He rarely bathed. He drank heavily. He was crude and obscene. But he also possessed genuine charisma and an uncanny psychological intuition. In 1905, Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg, where he gained a following among aristocratic ladies drawn to mysticism and exoticism. Through these connections, he was introduced to Nicholas and Alexandra. The timing was crucial. Alexei had just suffered a devastating hemorrhage. The doctors had given up hope. Alexandra was hysterical with grief. Rasputin was brought to the child's bedside. He prayed. He spoke calmly. He told Alexandra that Alexei would live, and the bleeding stopped. How did Rasputin do it? No one knows for certain. Some historians suggest his calmness reduced Alexandra's anxiety, which reduced Alexei's stress and blood pressure, which helped the bleeding stabilize. Others suggest he may have intuited that the doctor's constant interference, bloodletting, aspirin, which thins blood, was making things worse. And he simply told them to leave the child alone. Whatever the explanation, Alexandra was convinced Rasputin was a holy man, sent by God to save her son. From that moment, he had enormous influence over her, and through her, over Nicholas. Rasputin's presence at court was a public relations catastrophe. Rumors spread that he was sleeping with Alexandra, with the Grand Duchesses, that he was the real power behind the throne. Political cartoons depicted the imperial family as puppets, controlled by this drunken peasant. None of the sex rumors were true, but the political influence was very real. Alexandra consulted Rasputin on everything from Alexei's health to government appointments. She called him our friend, and believed his advice came directly from God. When Nicholas was away, she would write to him, "Our friend says you must do this," or "Our friend warns against that." Nicholas, who loved his wife and trusted her judgment, often followed this advice. Imagine the absurdity of this situation. Russia, a great power facing enormous challenges, had its policies influenced by an illiterate Siberian peasant mystic. Government ministers were appointed or dismissed based on Rasputin's recommendations. Military decisions were affected by his advice. This wasn't governance. This was madness. The Russian aristocracy and government ministers grew increasingly alarmed. Nicholas's own family members pleaded with him to banish Rasputin. His mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, refused to be in the same room as that charlatan. But Nicholas and Alexandra wouldn't listen. They saw attacks on Rasputin as attacks on their faith, their son, their family. They isolated themselves further, surrounded only by those who supported their view. This is the tragedy of Nicholas and Alexandra. They loved each other and their children with absolute devotion. That love was beautiful, but it also made them blind to political reality. They couldn't see that their private decisions were destroying public confidence in the monarchy. Meanwhile, Rasputin's behavior grew increasingly outrageous. He drank himself into stupors at expensive restaurants, groping women and boasting of his influence. He received petitioners who paid him to intercede with the imperial family. Prostitutes visited his apartment. The disconnect was staggering. While Russia's most powerful family vouched for Rasputin's holiness, everyone else saw a drunken fraud exploiting them. As Rasputin's influence grew, so did the clouds of war. In 1914, The complex web of European alliances pulled Russia into a conflict that would destroy four empires, including their own. On August 1, 1914, Russia entered the First World War against Germany and Austria-Hungary. In St. Petersburg, renamed Petrograd to sound less German, crowds gathered outside the Winter Palace, cheering for the Tsar. Nicholas appeared on the balcony. In military uniform, the crowd sang the national anthem and dropped to their knees. For a brief moment, the Tsar and his people were united. This was Nicholas's last moment of genuine popularity. The wave of patriotic fervor swept away years of resentment. Nicholas saw it as vindication, proof that Russia still loved its Tsar. He believed the war would strengthen his monarchy. He couldn't have been more wrong. The Russian military was unprepared for modern warfare. Soldiers were sent to the front without adequate rifles, ammunition, or food. Officers from the aristocracy commanded peasant soldiers with contempt. Tactics were outdated. Casualties were catastrophic. In the first year alone, Russia suffered over 2 million casualties, dead, wounded, or captured. The Russian army fought with tremendous courage, but it was a 19th century army fighting a 20th century war. Soldiers charged machine gun nests with bayonets. Artillery shells ran out after days. Wounded men died because there weren't enough medical supplies or doctors. It was a slaughter. Alexandra and her two eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, trained as Red Cross nurses and worked in military hospitals. They weren't figureheads. They dressed wounds, assisted in surgeries, comforted dying soldiers. Maria and Anastasia, too young to nurse, visited wounded men and wrote letters for those who couldn't write. This nursing work was genuine and courageous. Alexandra saw the horrors of war firsthand. Men with shattered limbs, blinded by gas, dying in agony. Her daughters, raised in such privilege, learned what war really meant. It changed them profoundly. But nursing couldn't stop the catastrophe unfolding across Russia. The war consumed everything. Factories shifted to military production, leaving civilians without basic goods. Men were drafted from farms, leading to food shortages. Railways, used to transport troops and supplies, couldn't deliver food to cities. By 1915, bread lines stretched for blocks. Prices soared. Workers went hungry. Mothers couldn't feed their children. And then, Nicholas made a catastrophic decision. In September 1915, against all advice, he dismissed the military commander and appointed himself Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces. He moved to military headquarters, hundreds of miles from Petrograd. This was disastrous on multiple levels. Nicholas had no military experience. He couldn't command an army, but by taking personal command, he made himself personally responsible for every defeat, every casualty. When things went wrong, and they went wrong constantly, he got the blame. And he left Alexandra, effectively in charge of the government, back in Petrograd. Alexandra, advised by Rasputin, began interfering directly in government. She pushed Nicholas to appoint ministers based on their loyalty to our friend rather than their competence. She dismissed capable men and replaced them with mediocrity and worse. In 3 years, Russia had for prime ministers 5 interior ministers, for agriculture ministers 3 war ministers. It was chaos, and Alexandra's German heritage, once just an inconvenience, became toxic. Wild rumors spread that she was a German spy, sending military secrets to the Kaiser, that she and Rasputin were plotting to sign a separate peace with Germany, to betray Russia and its allies. None of it was true. Alexandra was more Russian Orthodox than many Russians, and she hated Germany. But truth didn't matter. The rumor became the reality in people's minds. The Empress was accused of treachery, of conspiring with the enemy, of planning Russia's defeat. These accusations were false, but they were universally believed. Britain's ambassador tried to warn the emperor that his wife's unpopularity threatened the dynasty itself. Nicholas wouldn't listen. By late 1916, even members of the imperial family were conspiring against Alexandra and Rasputin. Nicholas's cousins, government ministers, and leaders of the Duma all agreed. Rasputin had to go. On the night of December 29, 1916, a group of conspirators led by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich invited Rasputin to Yusupov's palace. They fed him cakes and wine laced with cyanide. But Rasputin didn't die. In desperation, Yusupov shot him in the chest. Rasputin fell. The conspirators left him for dead. But when Yusupov returned to the body, Rasputin's eyes opened. He lunged at Yusupov and nearly strangled him before staggering out into the courtyard. The conspirators shot him 3 more times. They beat him with a club. Finally, they wrapped his body in cloth and dumped it through a hole in the ice of the Neva River. When his body was recovered days later, water was found in his lungs. Grigory Rasputin, the man who seemingly couldn't die, had finally drowned beneath the ice. The aristocrats who killed Rasputin thought they were saving Russia. They expected to be celebrated as heroes. But it was too late. Rasputin was just a symptom of the dysfunction, not the cause. His death changed nothing. Alexandra was devastated. She had lost the one person she believed could save her son. She insisted Rasputin be buried on the grounds of Tsarskoye Selo. Nicholas, consumed with grief for his wife, ordered an icon be buried with Rasputin. An icon signed by himself, Alexandra, and all 5 children. It was a final gesture of loyalty to the man who had helped destroy them. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was one of the coldest in Russian history. Food shortages worsened. Strikes increased. Soldiers began deserting the front. Revolution was coming, and the Romanovs couldn't see it. February 23, 1917, International Women's Day. Women textile workers in Petrograd walked off their jobs to protest bread shortages. They were joined by workers from other factories. By afternoon, over 90,000 people filled the streets. The Tsar's government expected the protests to fizzle, as they had before. They didn't. Every day, the crowds grew larger. By February 25th, over 200,000 workers were on strike. The whole city ground to a halt. The protests weren't organized by revolutionaries. They were spontaneous, driven by hunger and exhaustion and rage. People carried signs reading "Down with the war" and "Give us bread." But increasingly they shouted, "Down with the Tsar." Nicholas, at military headquarters, received urgent telegrams from Petrograd. His ministers begged him to return to the capital to address the crisis. Nicholas dismissed it as minor unrest. He ordered the army to restore order, with force if necessary. Nicholas's response showed how utterly disconnected he was from reality. He thought this was just another protest that could be suppressed with troops. He didn't understand that Russia itself had reached a breaking point. On February 26th, soldiers were ordered to fire on protesters. Some units did, killing dozens. But then something unprecedented happened. Soldiers began refusing orders. One regiment mutinied, then another. Instead of suppressing the revolution, the soldiers joined it. One revolutionary soldier later wrote, "We were told to shoot at women and children begging for bread. We looked at each other and knew we could not do this. These were our people, our mothers and sisters. We turned our rifles toward our officers instead." Within 48 hours, the entire Petrograd garrison, over 150,000 men, had mutinied. Prisons were opened. Government buildings were seized. The Tsar's ministers fled or were arrested. After 300 years, Romanov rule over Russia had collapsed. Not with a battle, but with a whimper. Nicholas finally tried to return to Petrograd. His train was stopped by revolutionaries. He tried to reach Tsarskoye Selo, where his family waited. That route was blocked too. On March 2, 1917, aboard his stranded train, Nicholas II was visited by representatives of the Duma. They told him the situation was hopeless. The army had turned against him. His government had dissolved. The people would not accept his rule. They asked him to abdicate. Nicholas was devastated, but also, in a strange way, relieved. He had never wanted to be Tsar. Now, the burden was lifted. He could return to his family. He initially abdicated in favor of Alexei, but then realized that would separate him from his son. So he abdicated for both himself and Alexei, naming his brother Grand Duke Michael as the new Tsar. Nicholas signed the document that ended the Romanov dynasty. 3 centuries of rule ended with the stroke of a pen. But Grand Duke Michael refused the throne. He wouldn't accept it without the consent of an elected assembly. Within 24 hours, Russia had no Tsar at all. The Russian Empire was dead. A provisional government took power, led by moderate liberals and socialists. They promised elections, civil liberties, continuation of the war effort. They also had to decide what to do with Nicholas and his family. The fallen Tsar asked for only one thing: to be allowed to live quietly with his family at Tsarskoye Selo. Then perhaps to go into exile in Britain. It seemed like a reasonable request. Nicholas had abdicated peacefully. He posed no threat. Surely he and his family could be allowed to leave Russia and live in exile. But in revolutionary Russia, nothing would be that simple. March 1917. Nicholas returned to Tsarskoye Selo as a prisoner in his own palace. The provisional government placed him and his family under house arrest for their own protection. Though whether they were being protected from the people or prevented from escaping was unclear. The family's reaction to the abdication was complex. Nicholas seemed almost relieved. The burden of ruling was gone. Alexandra was bitter, seeing it as a betrayal of God's will. The children were confused and frightened, but tried to stay positive. For the first time in their lives, they were just a family. No state duties, no ceremonies, no throne to protect. Their life became surreal. They were prisoners, but lived in a palace. Guards watched their every move, sometimes with outright hostility. Revolutionary soldiers mocked Nicholas, calling him Nicholas the Blood Drinker, and refusing to salute. Some guards drew obscene pictures of Alexandra and Rasputin on the palace walls. But inside, the family tried to maintain normalcy. Nicholas chopped wood, shoveled snow, and tended a vegetable garden. Alexandra and the girls sewed, read aloud, and put on little theatrical performances. Alexei, now 13, played with his toy soldiers and dreamed of the military career he would never have. Alexander Kerensky, the moderate socialist, who became head of the provisional government, visited the family several times. He was struck by how ordinary they seemed. He later wrote, "I found a decent, simple family. The emperor was courteous and calm. The empress was dignified but cold toward me. She blamed the government for their situation. The children were charming, well-mannered. Alexei was a beautiful boy, but clearly unwell. I left feeling these were not monsters, just people trapped by history." In the spring of 1917, all 5 children contracted measles. Maria and Anastasia became seriously ill. Alexandra nursed them through fevers and complications, just as she had throughout their childhood. For weeks, the family isolated in their sick rooms. By the time they recovered, Russia had changed again. The provisional government was struggling. They had continued the disastrous war, which the people hated. Food shortages worsened. More radical voices gained influence, especially the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, who had returned from exile with German help. Lenin promised 3 things: peace, land, and bread. He promised to end the war, redistribute land to peasants, and feed the cities. And he promised to punish those responsible for Russia's suffering. The Romanovs were on that list. the Bolsheviks used the Romanovs as symbols of everything wrong with old Russia. In their propaganda, Nicholas was the bloody Nicholas who had massacred workers. Alexandra was the German spy who betrayed Russia. The family represented tyranny, oppression, inequality. Making peace with them was impossible. They needed them as villains. By August 1917, Kerensky concluded the family was no longer safe at Tsarskoye Selo. Radical soldiers and workers wanted them put on trial or simply killed. The British government, led by King George V, Nicholas's first cousin, had quietly withdrawn its offer of asylum. George feared that housing the unpopular Russian royals might spark unrest in Britain. The British abandonment of the Romanovs is one of the great moral failures of the period. George V was Nicholas's physical double. They looked like twins. Their mothers were sisters. George owed his crown partly to Nicholas, who had supported British interests. But when Nicholas needed help, George turned his back. Kerensky decided to move the family to Tobolsk, a remote town in Siberia. It was far from revolutionary Petrograd, and its people were traditional, perhaps more sympathetic to the Tsar. In August 1917, the Romanovs boarded a train with blacked-out windows. They didn't know their destination. After days of travel, they arrived in Tobolsk and were housed in the governor's mansion, a large but modest building compared to their palaces. Life in Tobolsk was harsh but bearable. The family lived on the second floor, sharing rooms. They still had some servants who had chosen to follow them into exile. The guards were relatively respectful. The family could walk in a small courtyard, attend church services, and receive packages from supporters. Tatiana wrote in her diary, "We are prisoners, but at least we are together. Papa chops wood and seems more at peace than he has in years. Mama is always tired and her heart troubles her, but she smiles when we gather in the evening. We read, we sew, we pretend we are just an ordinary family on an ordinary day." The Grand Duchesses remained remarkably resilient. They put on plays for their parents. They taught lessons to Alexei. Olga painted and wrote poetry. Tatiana organized the household. Maria made friends with the guards, her warmth melting even hostile hearts. Anastasia continued her pranks, making everyone laugh. They were young women now. Olga was 22, Tatiana 20, Maria 18, Anastasia 16. In another life, they would have been making brilliant marriages to European royalty, wearing jewels, attending balls. Instead, they darned stockings and hauled water. What's remarkable about the Romanov children is that they never complained. They adapted to their reduced circumstances with grace and even good humor. They had been raised with privilege, but also with a sense of duty. Now their duty was simply to support each other and their parents. But while the Romanovs found peace in Siberian isolation, Russia descended into chaos. In October 1917, only 2 months after the family arrived in Tobolsk, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. Kerensky fled. The provisional government collapsed. The Bolsheviks declared a new era, the dictatorship of the proletariat. One of their first acts was to begin peace negotiations with Germany, betraying Russia's allies, but fulfilling Lenin's promise to end the war. And then, Russia exploded into civil war. The Bolshevik Reds fought the anti-Bolshevik Whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, Democrats, and military officers. Regions declared independence. Foreign powers intervened. Violence consumed the country. The Russian Civil War was one of the most brutal conflicts in history. Between 1917 and 1922, millions died. From combat, from disease, from famine, from terror. Both sides committed atrocities. Summary executions, torture, massacres of civilians. It was total war, and there were no rules. In April 1918, the Ural Regional Soviet, the Bolshevik government in the Ural Mountains region, demanded custody of the Romanovs. Tobolsk was too comfortable, too safe. The family needed to be held more securely. And there were whispers of another reason. Monarchist forces were advancing. There were rumors of rescue attempts. The Bolsheviks couldn't risk Nicholas being freed to become a rallying point for their enemies. The move was complicated by Alexei's health. He had suffered another hemorrhage and couldn't travel. The Bolsheviks insisted Nicholas and Alexandra come immediately to Ekaterinburg, the capital of the Ural region. For the first time in their imprisonment, the family would be separated. The decision of who would go and who would stay with Alexei was agonizing. Finally, Alexandra, Nicholas, and their daughter Maria went to Ekaterinburg. Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia stayed in Tobolsk with Alexei until he could travel. As they said goodbye, they had no idea it would be under such circumstances that they would next be reunited. Arrived in Ekaterinburg and were taken to a commandeered merchant house belonging to a man named Ipatiev. The Bolsheviks called it the House of Special Purpose. The house was nothing like their previous prisons. It was surrounded by a tall wooden palisade. The windows were whitewashed, so no one could see in or out. Guards watched constantly, some openly hostile. The Ipatiev House was designed as a prison, not a residence. The family was restricted to 5 rooms on the upper floor. They couldn't go outside. They were under constant surveillance. The guards were deliberately chosen for their revolutionary fervor and their hatred of the monarchy. The guards scrawled obscene graffiti on the walls, sexual drawings depicting Alexandra with Rasputin, crude poems mocking the family. They rifled through the family's belongings, stealing small items. They watched the family even in the bathroom, until Nicholas angrily demanded basic privacy. But this was no longer a world where an ex-Tsar's demands meant anything. In May, once Alexei could travel, the 4 remaining children journeyed to Ekaterinburg. The reunion in the Ipatiev House was bittersweet. The family was together again, but in the worst conditions they had yet experienced. They made the best of it. They still held to their routines. Prayers in the morning. Lessons for Alexei reading aloud in the evening. Nicholas read to his family from books in Russian, English, and French. Alexandra taught the girls to sew and embroider. Tatiana wrote in her diary almost every day, recording the mundane details of their imprisonment. The weather, what they ate, what they read. The entries are heartbreaking in their normalcy. On May 20th, she wrote, "Warm weather. Papa walked in the garden for 15 minutes. Mama's health is poor. We spent the evening reading Sherlock Holmes stories. Anastasia made us all laugh with her impersonation of the guard Avdiev, for servants had followed them into this final imprisonment. Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, the family physician, Anna Demidova, Alexandra's maid, Ivan Karadinov, the cook, and Alexei Trupp, Nicholas's valet. They could have left. They chose to stay. These 4 people deserve to be remembered as heroes. They owed the Romanovs nothing. The monarchy had fallen. Nicholas had no power. There would be no reward for loyalty. But they stayed because they loved the family they served. They stayed knowing it might cost them their lives. Alexei was now 13, on the cusp of manhood, but trapped in a fragile body. His last hemorrhage had been severe. He couldn't walk and had to be carried or pushed in a wheelchair. He spent his days playing with toy soldiers, reading adventure stories, dreaming of freedom. The 4 grand duchesses occupied themselves with needlework. But this wasn't merely entertainment. They were sewing jewels into their clothing. Diamonds, pearls, and precious gems from the imperial collection, sewn into bodices and hems. It was insurance, emergency funds if they ever escaped. The jewels would serve a different purpose in the end. By July 1918, the Bolsheviks' position in the Urals was precarious. The White Army was advancing on Ekaterinburg from multiple directions. If the Whites captured the city, they would free Nicholas. He could become a figurehead for their movement, a legitimate alternative to Bolshevik rule. Lenin couldn't allow that. In Moscow, Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership debated what to do with the Romanovs. Some argued for a public trial, to expose the crimes of the monarchy. Others said there was no time. The Whites were coming. The telegraph lines between Moscow and Ekaterinburg hummed with encrypted messages. Exactly what was decided and who authorized it remains disputed by historians. But the local Ural Soviet had already made their decision. In early July, a new commandant was appointed to the Ipatiev House. His name was Yakov Yurovsky, a Bolshevik revolutionary and former photographer. He was intelligent, organized, and ruthless. Unlike the previous guards, Yurovsky wasn't interested in tormenting the family. He was polite, almost professional. He was there to do a job. Yurovsky's appointment was significant. The Bolsheviks were putting a competent, dependable man in charge. That suggested something was being planned, something that required precision. The days passed. The weather turned hot. Outside the whitewashed windows, the family could hear the sounds of a city preparing for war. Soldiers marching, artillery moving, anxious voices. On July 14th, Bastille Day in France, ironically, Yurovsky ordered a mysterious test. He had the family and servants move to different rooms and recorded where everyone would be standing. He asked about Alexei's health, whether the boy could walk. July 16, 1918. The family spent the day, as they had spent countless others. Nicholas read, Alexandra sewed and wrote in her diary. The girls helped their mother and played with Alexei. Dr. Botkin examined his patients. The cook prepared simple meals. In her final diary entry, Alexandra wrote about the weather and her concern for Alexei's health. The entry is mundane quotidian. She had no idea these were her last written words. That evening, at 10:30, the family went to bed. They said their prayers. They kissed each other goodnight. Outside, Yurovsky made his final preparations. At midnight, everything would change. What follows is a historically accurate account of the Romanov family's final hours. While we will not show graphic imagery, the events described are disturbing. This is the truth of what happened in the early morning of July 17, 1918. Shortly after midnight, Dr. Botkin was awakened by Yurovsky. He was told that unrest in the city made it unsafe for the family to remain in their rooms. They needed to move to the basement for protection. Botkin woke the family. They dressed quickly. The Grand Duchesses put on the skirts with jewels sewn into the fabric, thinking they might be escaping. Nicholas carried Alexei, who couldn't walk. Alexandra, her health poor, asked for chairs to be brought. They descended the stairs. Nicholas carrying his son, Alexandra leaning on her daughters, the servants following. They were led to a semi-basement room, about 16 feet by 18 feet, with a heavy metal door. 2 chairs were brought in. Alexandra sat in one. Nicholas placed Alexei in the other, arranging cushions to make his son comfortable. The family and servants arranged themselves in the room. In the back row stood Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Next to them stood Dr. Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Karanov, and Alexei Trupp. In front, Alexandra sat in her chair. Nicholas stood beside Alexei. Yurovsky told them to wait. He left the room. What were they thinking in those last moments? Did they suspect? Probably not. They had been moved before, threatened before, but always they had survived. Perhaps they thought this was another relocation, that they would be boarding a train by morning. Yurovsky returned with 11 other men, all armed. They crowded into the doorway and the small antechamber outside. Nicholas stood up, confused. What? He began. Yurovsky interrupted him. He read from paper. Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas turned pale. He started to say, What? But the words caught in his throat. Alexandra and Olga began to cross themselves. Yurovsky drew his revolver and shot Nicholas in the chest at point-blank range. Nicholas died instantly. Then All 11 men opened fire. The shooting lasted approximately 20 minutes. The room filled with smoke and screaming. Some of the family and servants died quickly. Others did not. The jewels sewn into the girls' clothing acted as armor, deflecting bullets. When the guns fell silent, some of the family members were still alive. The executioners used rifle bayonets and the butts of their guns to finish the task. When it was over, 11 people were dead. The entire family: Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, and 4 servants who had refused to abandon them: Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Karanov, and Alexei Trupp. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven to a mine shaft in the forest called Gneiniyama, about 12 miles from Ekaterinburg. The executioners attempted to destroy the bodies using sulfuric acid and fire. They partially succeeded. When they feared they would be discovered, they moved the remains to a different location along a muddy road. There, they dug a shallow grave and buried what remained of the Romanov family and their loyal servants. For 60 years, the location of this grave remained a secret, known only to the executioners. The execution of the Romanovs was one of the most brutal acts of the Russian Revolution. It wasn't done in the heat of battle or mob violence. It was premeditated, planned, and carried out in cold blood. Children were murdered. Servants who had done nothing were murdered. It was, by any definition, a crime. The Bolsheviks initially announced only that Nicholas had been executed and that his family had been sent to a safe place. The truth leaked out slowly in rumors and whispered stories. Lenin's government claimed the execution had been carried out by the Ural Soviet without Moscow's approval, a local decision in a time of crisis. Most historians now believe Lenin approved, if not explicitly ordered, the execution. The Romanovs were not the only members of the imperial family to be killed. Over the next year, Bolsheviks executed at least 17 other Romanovs, Grand Dukes, princes, and cousins of the Tsar. Some were thrown down mine shafts alive. Others were shot in front of firing squads. The Bolsheviks wanted to ensure no Romanov could ever challenge their power. Eight days after the execution, the White Army captured Ekaterinburg. They found the Ipatiev House empty, the basement room stained with blood and pockmarked with bullet holes. A White Army investigator named Nikolai Sokolov began gathering evidence. He interviewed witnesses, collected bullets and fragments of bones from the mine shaft, documented everything he found. His report, published years later, would be the first authoritative account of what happened. But without bodies, many people refused to believe the family was truly dead. The lack of bodies created a mystery that lasted decades. Rumors spread that one or more of the children had survived. Anastasia, in particular, became the focus of speculation. Over the years, dozens of women claimed to be the lost Grand Duchess. The most famous was Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Anastasia for over 60 years. She convinced some people, including a few former imperial courtiers. Books were written about her. Movies were made. She became a celebrity. But she was not Anastasia. DNA testing after her death proved conclusively that she was a Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska. The real Anastasia died with her family in that basement room. For decades, the Soviet Union denied knowing where the bodies were buried. They claimed ignorance or said the bodies had been completely destroyed. The execution site became a state secret. But some people knew. In 1979, 2 amateur historians, Alexander Avdinin and filmmaker Jelly Ryabov, used clues from Yurovsky's memoirs to locate the burial site. They secretly excavated and found bones, pieces of pottery, bullets. They reburied everything and kept their discovery secret. It was still Soviet times, Revealing such a find could be dangerous. In 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, Abdinin and Ryabov announced their discovery. Official excavations began. Forensic teams from Russia and around the world analyzed the remains. 9 bodies were found at the main burial site. Forensic examination and DNA testing confirmed these were Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, Dr. Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Karadinov, and Alexei Trupp. 2 bodies were missing. Alexei and one of his sisters, most likely Maria. In 2007, another amateur researcher found a second burial site, a short distance from the first. 2 bodies, badly burned and fragmented. A teenage boy and a young woman. DNA testing confirmed these were Alexei and Maria. The entire family had been found. On July 17, 1998, 80 years to the day after the execution, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia were buried with full ceremony in the Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, alongside other Russian emperors. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children as passion bearers. People who face death with Christian humility and forgiveness. They are now saints in the Orthodox Church. Icons depicting them adorn churches across Russia. Their feast day is July 17th, the anniversary of their deaths. The Ipatiev House was demolished by Soviet authorities in 1977 on the orders of Boris Yeltsin to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site. It became one anyway. Today, the church on blood stands on the site, a massive Orthodox cathedral commemorating the murdered family. Thousands visit each year. The Romanovs' execution was meant to erase them from history, to close the chapter on imperial Russia forever. Instead, it transformed them into martyrs. They became more powerful in death than Nicholas ever was as Tsar. Who were the Romanovs? That's the question we must return to now, at the end. They were not the monsters of Bolshevik propaganda, but neither were they the perfect martyrs of royalist mythology. Nicholas was a loving father and devoted husband, but a weak and indecisive ruler whose incompetence contributed to Russia's disasters. Alexandra was a caring mother whose fierce love for her family blinded her to political reality. The children were innocent victims who never had a chance to be more than their parents' legacy. What haunts us most about the Romanovs is the ordinariness of their private lives. They were a family who loved each other deeply. They had inside jokes, pet names, favorite books. They were real people, flawed, human, relatable. And they were murdered for the accident of their birth. The execution of the Romanov children, particularly Alexei, who was only 13, remains one of the great atrocities of the 20th century. Whatever Nicholas's failures as a ruler, whatever Alexandra's political errors, those children were innocent. Olga, who loved music and dreamed of a simple life. Tatiana, who organized everything and cared for her mother. Maria, whose kindness touched everyone she met. Anastasia, who made people laugh even in the darkest times. Alexei, a boy who wanted nothing more than to grow up healthy. They deserved to live. The 20th century would see many such atrocities. Mass murders, genocides, political killings. The Romanovs were among the first, but tragically not the last. Their deaths marked the end of an era, the final collapse of the old European order that had ruled for centuries. 3 other empires fell in the aftermath of World War I, the German, Austrian, and Ottoman. But only the Romanovs died this way, murdered in a basement room, in the middle of the night. In modern Russia, the Romanovs have been rehabilitated. The government embraces them as symbols of Russian tradition and Orthodox faith. But this rehabilitation is selective. It celebrates them as martyrs, while ignoring Nicholas's failures and the genuine grievances that caused the revolution. Today, you can visit the palaces where they lived. Tsarskoye Selo, Levadia, the Winter Palace. You can see their belongings, read their letters, look at their photographs. Tourism has transformed them into a brand, a nostalgic fantasy of imperial splendor. but step away from the golden halls and remember. This story ends in a basement with a family huddled together in the last moments of their lives. This is the last photograph of the Romanov family together, taken in the spring of 1918 in Tobolsk. Look at their faces. Nicholas, 50 years old, looks far older, broken by abdication and imprisonment. Alexandra, 46, shows the strain of years of worry. The daughters, young women in their late teens and early 20s, try to smile. Alexei sits in his father's arms, always the fragile child. They are a family, holding on to each other, literally and figuratively. Within 3 months of this photograph, they would all be dead. Every July 17th, thousands gather at the Church on Blood in Ekaterinburg for an all-night vigil. They pray for the souls of the murdered family. They light candles. They remember. Some come because they're Orthodox believers who venerate the Romanovs as saints. Some come out of historical interest. And some come because they're moved by the fundamental tragedy of the story, a family destroyed by forces beyond their control. At Ganina Yama, where the bodies were first taken, 7 Orthodox churches now stand, one for each family member. Monks live there. Pilgrims visit. The forest that once hid a crime scene is now a place of peace. The Romanovs wanted nothing more than to live quietly together. Nicholas wrote, after his abdication, that he hoped for a peaceful life with my family. That's all he wanted in the end. Not power, not empire, just his wife and children around him. He got 15 months of that life before it ended in the worst way imaginable. The Russian Revolution promised to create a new world, a workers' paradise, a society of perfect equality. Instead, it created the Soviet Union, a totalitarian state that would kill millions of its own people in purges, famines, and gulags. The Romanovs were among its first victims. But their deaths didn't build a better Russia. Their blood didn't water the seeds of utopia. They died for nothing, and their deaths changed nothing, except to add more suffering to an already suffering nation. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the Romanovs. Not that revolution is wrong, or that monarchy is right, but that violence, once unleashed, consumes everyone, the guilty and innocent alike. That children should never pay for their parents' mistakes. That murder, even in the name of justice, remains murder. Russia survived the Romanovs. It survived the revolution, the civil war, the Soviet Union, and its collapse. Russians today live in a different world than Nicholas and his family could have imagined. A world of technology, democracy, in some form, connection to the broader world. But the story of the last royal family still resonates, perhaps because it's ultimately a story we all understand, a family trying to stay together in a world falling apart. They failed. The world tore them apart. But for over a century now, we've remembered them. We've told their story. We've kept them alive in our collective memory. And in a small room, in what was once the Ipatiev House, beneath a church built to honor them, there's a cross on the wall marking the spot where they died. People come there to pray, to think, to mourn. The Romanovs are gone. The Russian Empire is gone. Even the Soviet Union that killed them is gone. But memory remains. And as long as we remember, as long as we tell the story, they are not entirely lost. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Karadinov, and Alexei Trupp, murdered July 17, 1918. May their memory be eternal.